Thank you so much, Martha, and everyone who is associated with running this conference for just a wonderful conversation today. I feel really honored to be able to talk to you today about Pauli Murray. And as Martha mentioned earlier, I think it's always striking to me how famous Pauli Murray deserves to be, and yet how a few people have heard of her. Pauli Murray's relative invisibility to history, I think, is in part an artifact of her prescience. As her protege, Eleanor Holmes Norton, put it, she lived on the edge of history, seeming to pull it along with her. In 1938, more than a decade before the Supreme Court ruled that state-run graduate schools could not exclude African-American students, Murray applied to the University of North Carolina's graduate program in sociology in the hopes of launching a test case. More than a decade before Rosa Parks launched the Montgomery bus boycott and revitalized the civil rights movement, Pauli Murray was arrested for sitting in the front of a bus in Northern Virginia. Murray helped to lead sit-in demonstrations in Washington, D.C. restaurants during World War II, long before the 1960 sit-ins made these protests the avant-garde of nonviolent civil disobedience. As a student at Howard University Law School in 1944, Murray boldly declared to her classmates the heretical view that it was time for civil rights lawyers to challenge the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson head-on. Murray even bet her professor, civil rights lawyer Spotswood Robinson, $10 that the Supreme Court would overrule Plessy within 25 years. Little did either of them dream that she would collect on her wager within the decade. Murray also played an important behind-the-scenes role in shaping the litigation strategy in Brown versus Board of Education. In writing their brief, Robinson and Thurgood Marshall adopted her argument, made in a law school seminar paper, that segregation could be unconstitutional because it imposed a badge of inferiority on black children. Murray's unsuccessful attempt to gain entrance to Harvard Law School in 1944 laid the groundwork for women's admission several years later. Undaunted, she went on to become the first African American to receive a doctorate in law from Yale Law School. But Murray's most significant and lasting contributions to the law emerged from her pivotal strategic role in feminist legal advocacy throughout the 1960s. In 1962, while serving with the President's Commission on the Status of Women, Murray authored a pivotal memorandum laying out a 14th Amendment litigation strategy based on a rhetorical, legal, and strategic analogy to race and civil rights that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other feminists would pursue a decade later. So I want to talk a little bit about Pauli Murray's contributions to feminist legal thought and activism. So since winning the right to vote in 1920, advocates for women had disagreed, often bitterly, over the proposed Equal Rights Amendment. That debate pitted ERA proponents, led by Alice Paul's National Women's Party, against opponents like Esther Peterson of the Department of Labor's Women's Bureau. People like Peterson worried that an ERA would invalidate protective labor laws like minimum wage and maximum hours legislation for women workers. This was a long-standing dispute that really divided people who were concerned about women's legal status. Murray broke this impasse. She recommended a renewed effort to litigate, a strategy that was modeled on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's campaign in the courts. Pursuing litigation under the 14th Amendment circumvented the divisive ERA controversy. But also, and probably more importantly to Murray herself, tying race and sex together through this race-sex analogy and through the 14th Amendment held out the promise of overcoming the rift between the civil rights and women's movements and uniting the two movements around a common cause. It would take the passage of a sex discrimination amendment to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to fully extricate the movement for women's legal equality from an opportunistic alliance with segregationists. And this is a picture of Representative Howard Smith of Virginia, one of the leading segregationists in the House, who was responsible for introducing the Sex Amendment to Title VII. So here again, Murray played a crucial role. The sex discrimination provision of Title VII was introduced as a killer amendment by segregationist Congressman Howard Smith in an effort to defeat the Civil Rights Bill. Some supporters painted the sex discrimination amendment as essential to protect white Christian women from discrimination in a new era of rights for non-white workers. So in other words, as African-American workers, usually figured as men, were entering the workforce, and women as well, the idea was we need to protect white women from discrimination since we're now protecting African-Americans. Many civil rights advocates, as a result, worried that the sex amendment would sink the bill. Once again, Murray stepped in, this time to write another influential and widely circulated memo. She argued that the inclusion of sex discrimination was crucial to realizing the Act's primary goal of eradicating racial discrimination. Without the provision, she wrote, 1/2 of the Negro population, Negro women, would be left unprotected from discrimination. So Murray's memo, by highlighting the plight of black women, convinced skeptics in the White House and Congress that the sex discrimination provision was compatible with and even necessary to vindicate the Act's primary purpose. In 1965, Murray called on women to organize and fight for the enforcement of Title VII, suggesting that a women's march on Washington might be necessary if the EEOC's notorious foot-dragging continued. Murray's provocative words caught the attention of Betty Friedan, author of the 1963 bestseller, The Feminine Mystique. Together, Friedan, Murray, and several others founded the National Organization for Women in 1966. Murray also co-authored a seminal article called Jane Crow and the Law, which first developed the argument for applying the 14th Amendment and Title VII to sex discrimination in employment. And Murray also continued to litigate promising 14th Amendment cases in the hopes that one would reach the Supreme Court and produce the breakthrough women's rights decision that feminists were seeking. Murray set her sights on a case called White versus Crook. In that case, Gardenia White and several other African-American women and men challenged their exclusion from a jury that had acquitted the murderers of 2 civil rights activists. In 1965, Alabama was one of 3 states that excluded women from jury service by law, and one of many southern states that kept black women and men off the jury rolls by longstanding practice. Murray convinced the ACLU and the Justice Department to challenge both forms of jury exclusion and helped to write the sex discrimination portion of the brief in White versus Crook. Gardenia White won her case in Alabama federal court, but the jury service cases never reached the Supreme Court. Murray had hoped that White versus Crook would be what she called Women's Brown versus Board of Education, with its compelling fusion of African-American civil rights and women's rights. Instead, she and others came to believe that a new constitutional amendment might be necessary after all. When Murray campaigned for the ERA's passage, she always reminded skeptics and supporters alike that, as she put it, Jim and Jane Crow are twins. Meanwhile, many of Murray's doctrinal arguments later found their way to the Supreme Court via Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose ACLU Women's Rights Project pressed, largely successfully, Murray's 14th Amendment strategy and her analogy between race and sex discrimination. And Ginsburg credited Murray as a co-author on the so-called grandmother brief in Reed versus Reed, which was the first Supreme Court case to find an equal protection violation and discrimination against women. This is a picture of Sharon and Joseph Frontiero, who were the plaintiffs in another important case that Ginsburg argued based on Murray's theory. Both the substance of Murray's legal arguments and the strategic coalition she built profoundly influenced feminist lawyers throughout the 1970s. By 1973, though, Murray had moved on. After losing her longtime friend and companion to cancer, Murray left her hard-won academic appointment at Brandeis to enter an Episcopal seminary at age 63. She took a considerable risk in doing so, for the church had yet to ordain women. But that was no obstacle to Murray, who became one of the first female Episcopal priests in 1977. She preached her universalist vision of indivisible human rights until her own death from cancer in 1985. Murray's accomplishments were and are breathtaking. But such innovation and insight do not often spring from the minds of the comfortable or the conformist. Pauli Murray's life was rich and rewarding in many ways, but it was often full of pain, loneliness, isolation, confusion, and hardship. Murray's complicated and evolving sense of identity fused with her formidable intellect to shape a worldview that was as unique as it was universalist. Murray was an outsider who was not content to remain on the outside. She was by many accounts stubborn and combative in person, even as she sought through her writing, preaching, and activism to overcome divisions, build coalitions, bridge seemingly unbridgeable gaps. The legacy of slavery and the reality of Jim Crow hovered over Murray's life. Born and raised in Durham, North Carolina in the 1910s and 1920s, she was the granddaughter of a slave and the great-granddaughter of a slave owner. Orphaned at an early age, she was raised by her mother's family and grew up trying to reconcile her grandmother Cornelia Fitzgerald's vocal admiration of her aristocratic white forebears with Cornelia's excruciating recollections of how her white father had raped and brutalized her black birth mother. Murray vividly described the physical and emotional legacy of that history in her poetry. Murray was one of many black Southerners who reluctantly sought exile in the North, where racial barriers were formidable but often less formal, and racial violence less omnipresent but all the more unsettling. Economic hardship almost derailed Murray's education at Hunter College in the 1930s. She suffered from malnutrition and had to leave school for a year to work full-time. She graduated to bleak economic prospects, at one point riding the rails to look for work before she found a job with the WPA. Though she fell on the anti-communist side of the leftist organizations in which she became involved, Murray's political activities during this period haunted her later during the McCarthy era. The 1930s and early 40s also found Murray wrestling with her complicated sexual and gender identity, which caused her severe mental and sometimes physical anguish. Feeling that she was a man trapped in a woman's body, Murray experimented with various modes of dress and self-presentation in an attempt to find her place in a world with little room for gender ambiguity, much less for the sexual attraction that Murray felt for other women. Indeed, when Murray and a friend were arrested in 1940 for refusing to sit in the back of a bus bound for Durham, Murray was dressed as a young man and escorting Adeline McBean, who was her roommate and probably her romantic partner, home to meet her aunts and celebrate Easter. After what she later cryptically described as a brief and disastrous marriage to a man, Murray suffered more than one mental breakdown. From her room in a psychiatric hospital, Murray wrote eloquent letters asking doctors for help securing hormonal and other treatments for her condition, evidence that she both internalized and struggled against the pathologization of her gender ambivalence. During her years at Howard Law School, in the 1940s, Murray was often the lone woman in a class of talented and ambitious young African-American men. There, Murray confronted what she began to call Jane Crow, in the form of overt and subtle forms of discrimination and exclusion. She was at the top of her class, and the tradition held that Howard's top graduate would receive a fellowship for graduate work at Harvard Law School. But as Martha mentioned earlier, Harvard rejected Murray's application, saying, quote, "Your photograph and salutation indicate that you are not of the sex eligible for admission." Murray enlisted the help of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, whom she had befriended through a Depression-era correspondence about civil rights, and FDR himself wrote a letter of support to the Harvard faculty. But the Harvard Corporation deferred her appeal to the faculty, and Murray persisted. And I'll read the quote again, because it's a great quote. "Gentlemen," she wrote, "I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way to such change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds." Murray's seemingly lighthearted reference to a desired sex change was much closer to the truth than the Harvard professors would ever know. In some senses, the rejection from Harvard was a piercing reprise of Murray's correspondence with University of North Carolina officials, who just 6 years earlier had informed her that, quote, "members of your race are not admitted to the university." But in another way, this was more devastating, she later wrote, because she could not share her disappointment with a cadre of like-minded activists. Harvard's rejection, she wrote, was, quote, a source of mild amusement to many of my male colleagues who were ardent civil rights advocates, which made it all the more bitter to swallow. The harsh reality was that I was a minority within a minority. As a Negro woman, she was, as she often said, caught between the twin evils of Jim and Jane Crow. Her gender and sexual identity confusion, on the other hand, had a constructive side. Jane Crow, as historian Kenneth Mack writes, was, quote, a theory born from her own struggles with categories that seemed to do violence to Murray's sense of self. Sometimes the categories of black and white, but far more often men and women. Murray had gone to law school in hopes of becoming a civil rights lawyer. But in the late 40s and 50s, Murray struggled to find regular work as any kind of lawyer, in part because of her past political associations. It was during this period that she wrote Proud Shoes, a family history that religion scholar Sarah Azaransky has called, quote, an alternative account of American history distinguished by entanglement of the races and of relatedness in order to expand our sense of who we are. By the end of the 50s, Murray had found a job practicing law at Paul Weiss in New York, but McCarthyite political repression and racial violence in the United States led Murray to the brink of despair. She left to teach law in Ghana, hoping finally to find a home in Africa. Ironically, in Ghana, Murray found herself defending American constitutional principles to Pan-Africanists whose vision she never adopted as her own. After a year and a half or so, Murray was back in the U.S., rededicated to remaking American democracy in her own universalist image. Murray played a pivotal role in building coalitions between the Black freedom and women's movement in particular, connecting these causes intellectually, constitutionally, and spiritually. Her periodic alienation from her fellow activists was both personally painful and politically productive. After enduring what she called, quote, a kind of fateful exclusion from the inner circle of civil rights activities, feminism felt like home to Murray, she wrote to a friend in 1966. But less than a year later, she perceived NOW, the National Organization for Women, which was sort of the premier women's rights organization of the period, as sidelining alliances with civil rights and labor advocates that had been so important to her. Murray wrote of her, quote, inability to be fragmented into Negro at one time, woman at another, worker at another. She left NOW feeling like a stranger in my own household, passé, old, and declassed. For the next several years, Murray would pursue her feminist legal advocacy within the ACLU and as a pioneering professor of American Studies, who developed some of the first Black women's studies courses. An early proponent of Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience, Murray believed strongly in integration and in Dr. King's beloved community. This commitment, too, was sorely tested in the late 60s when African-American students influenced by the Black Power movement occupied buildings at Brandeis where she taught, at one point threatening to blow up the building that housed Murray's office. Murray recoiled from such tactics and from the anti-feminism of many Black Power advocates, which repulsed and alienated her. Again, she felt a sense of dislocation and disillusionment among the people, the young people who should have been her heirs and protégés. Storytelling was an integral part of Murray's life and work. Throughout her life, Murray used many different kinds of storytelling to make sense of her own experience and to convey the richness of her ideas to others. Murray had come to see in her family's own painful but ultimately triumphant history a metaphor for racial reconciliation and the redemption of American democracy, which she elaborated in Proud Shoes, the story of an American family. As a young woman, she wrote poetry that conveyed her liminal racial status as a light-skinned Negro woman. Negro woman was a term that she insisted upon throughout her life, even after Black and Afro-American came into vogue. And she explored themes of exclusion, violence, and hope in her poetry. Murray published many of her poems. She did not, in contrast, display the photo albums she created of herself experimenting with different modes of dress, many of them masculine and adventurous during this period. Her autobiography, published posthumously, did not mention directly her struggles with gender or sexual identity or her romantic relationships with women. Historical sociologist Lila Rupp describes interviewing Murray in the 1980s and leaving the question of her sexual orientation unasked but hovering. At the same time, Murray had revealed her gender ambivalence to her Aunt Pauline a half-century earlier. Murray wrote in 1943 to the woman she called mother, quote, "This little boy-girl personality, as you jokingly call it, sometimes gets me into trouble. The world does not accept my pattern of life, and to try to live by society's standards always causes me such inner conflict that at times it's almost unbearable. I don't know whether I'm right or whether society or some medical authority is right. I only know how I feel and what makes me happy." And in the rich archival records she left to the Schlesinger Women's History Library at Radcliffe, Murray chronicled her efforts to seek medical and psychiatric treatment in the 1940s. Throughout her life, she wrote long and revealing letters to friends and family, many of which she preserved for posterity. In her final decade as an Episcopal priest, Murray had a real pulpit from which to speak, and sermons became her storytelling mode of choice. In her political, constitutional, and theological writings, Murray used the historically symbiotic relationship between abolitionism and women's rights to call for contemporary coalitions between African American freedom and feminism. The woman question had divided abolitionists. The Negro question had divided feminists. Murray's political and spiritual mission was to persuade their modern incarnations to unite in pursuit of universal human rights. And so it was fitting that Murray's inaugural sermon as the first African-American female Episcopal priest, delivered in the Chapel Hill Sanctuary where her enslaved grandmother had been baptized more than a century earlier, contained a prayer for the Equal Rights Amendment's passage. "All the strands of my life had come together," Murray recalled in her autobiography. "Descendant of slave and of slave owner, now I was empowered to minister the sacrament of one in whom there is no north or south, no black or white, no male or female, only the spirit of love and reconciliation drawing us all toward the goal of human wholeness." In 2010, Pauli Murray officially became an Episcopal saint. I'll close by reading a few lines from one of Murray's poems, read at the service honoring her memory. "I have been enslaved, yet my spirit is unbound. I have been cast aside, but I sparkle in the darkness. I have been slain, but live on in the river of history." Thanks.